The sky hung low with heavy clouds, the kind that whispered secrets only the wind could understand. A lone figure moved through the narrow streets, his coat fluttering in the cold evening breeze. His mind was a battlefield of thoughts, memories clashing like warriors in a war that had no end. He had always been a seeker, chasing the essence of wisdom, searching for something more than just the fleeting moments life had offered him. As he walked, his footsteps echoed against the cobblestone paths, each step pulling him deeper into contemplation. He had read countless books, listened to the great minds of history, yet something always felt just beyond his grasp. He had followed paths that promised enlightenment, only to find himself standing at the edge of yet another unanswered question. Tonight was no different. The city lights shimmered in the distance, illuminating his thoughts, but the answers remained elusive. He paused at the old bookstore, its wooden sign creaking in the wind. It was a place he had visited many times, a sanctuary of forgotten wisdom buried within dust-covered pages. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with eyes that held stories of their own, greeted him with a knowing nod. Without a word, he walked to the back of the store, where bookshelves leaned against one another as if carrying the weight of history. His fingers traced the spines of old manuscripts, searching for something, though he wasn't sure what. Then, as if guided by an unseen force, his hand stopped on a book bound in worn leather. The title was barely visible, its letters faded by time. He pulled it from the shelf, the pages rustling like whispers of the past. Sitting at a small wooden table by the window, he opened the book and began to read. The words within seemed to speak directly to him, as if they had been waiting for this moment, for him. The book spoke of resilience, of enduring life's storms with an unshakable mind. It told of those who had walked before him, men and women who had faced suffering yet never wavered in their inner strength. He read about a philosopher who had been imprisoned, yet even within cold, dark walls, he found freedom in his thoughts. Another passage described a man who had lost everything, yet he stood tall, unbroken, his spirit untouched by misfortune. These were not just words. They were echoes of lives lived with purpose, of minds that had conquered despair. Something within him stirred. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. He realized that wisdom was not something to be found in books alone. It had to be lived, experienced, tested in the fire of adversity. He had spent years searching for the perfect answer, the ultimate truth. But now he understood. There was no single revelation that would change everything. Instead, it was a continuous journey, a discipline of the mind, a way of seeing the world differently. He closed the book and exhaled, watching as his breath fogged up the window before him. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the revelations unfolding within this small bookstore. People hurried past, their minds occupied with worries of their own. Yet, for the first time in a long while, he did not feel lost among them. He had found something more valuable than answers. He had found direction. The shopkeeper, sensing his moment of reflection, walked over and placed a cup of tea beside him. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked with a quiet smile. He looked up, meeting the old man's gaze. He didn't need to speak the words, for the answer was already understood between them. He simply nodded, lifting the cup to his lips. The warmth spread through him, not just from the tea, but from something deeper, a spark that had been reignited within his soul. He left the bookstore that night with the book in hand, but more importantly, with a newfound resolve. The journey was far from over. There would be struggles ahead, moments of doubt and hardship. But now, he knew that strength was not found in avoiding suffering, but in facing it with a steady heart. And as he walked back into the night, the wind no longer whispered secrets he couldn't understand. Instead, it carried the echoes of wisdom, reminding him that the path of resilience was one he would walk for a lifetime. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city. As he walked, his mind felt different, lighter, yet more focused. The book in his hand felt heavier than before, not because of its physical weight, but because of the truths it carried. He had spent years drifting between ideas, searching for something to anchor himself to, and now, for the first time, he felt as though he had found the beginning of a path not of comfort, but of discipline, of control over the only thing that had ever truly belonged to him, his mind. As he reached his small apartment, he placed the book on his desk and stood in front of the mirror. He studied his own reflection, not just the face staring back at him, but the years etched into it. The silent battles, the quiet struggles, the moments of weakness. He had always thought that strength came from winning against life's difficulties. But now, he saw things differently. Strength was not in victory, but in endurance. In standing firm despite the storm. He turned away and opened the book again. The next chapter spoke of a man who had been born into great power, but chose a life of simplicity. A ruler, yet a servant to wisdom. He had commanded armies, sat on a throne, yet his mind remained untangled by ambition, unmoved by flattery, untouched by luxury. He had written his thoughts in quiet moments, reflecting on the impermanence of everything. This was a man who could have had everything, yet he understood that the greatest possession was mastery over himself. The words struck something deep within him. He had spent so much of his life chasing things, recognition, security, even happiness, without realizing that all of it was temporary. No matter how much he gained, it could always be taken away. And if a man's happiness depended on things he could lose, then he was never truly free. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. How many times had he allowed himself to be disturbed by things that, in the grand scheme of life, meant nothing? How often had he let his emotions be dictated by external forces, by what others thought, by the fear of failure, by the weight of expectations? He had been living as if life was something that needed to be controlled, when in reality the only thing he had any true control over was himself. The thought felt both freeing and terrifying. If he accepted that nothing was permanent, that suffering was inevitable, then he could no longer blame the world for his unhappiness. There would be no more excuses. He could not wait for life to be easy, for people to be kind, for everything to go his way. He had to learn to stand firm regardless of the circumstances, to remain steady no matter how much the world around him shifted. His mind drifted to a memory from years ago, a moment of failure that had left him broken for weeks. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything. He had let it define him, had allowed it to take control over his thoughts, to shape his sense of worth. But now, looking back, he realized that it had only been as devastating as he had allowed it to be. The event itself had not destroyed him. His reaction to it had. The suffering had not come from the moment itself, but from his resistance to it, from his refusal to accept and move forward. He closed the book, pressing his fingers against its worn cover as if trying to absorb the wisdom it held. He could not change the past, but he could change how he carried it. He could not control what the future would bring, but he could control how he met it. And perhaps that was enough. A faint smile touched his lips, not of happiness, but of quiet understanding. He had spent so much of his life looking outward for answers when all along, they had been within him. He had been seeking control over the world when all he truly needed was control over himself. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it did not need to be. Strength was not in avoiding hardship, but in facing it without fear. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and placed the book beside his bed. Tomorrow, the world would be the same, filled with challenges, unpredictability, and chaos. But he would not be the same. He would meet it with a steadier mind, with a heart that did not waver, with an understanding that no matter what came his way, he would endure. Because in the end, That was what true strength was. Not in conquering the world, but in conquering oneself. The early morning light crept through the gaps in his curtains, casting soft, golden streaks across the walls. He had not slept much, but he didn't feel tired. His mind had been too alive, too engaged with the weight of the thoughts that had settled within him. He sat up, the book still resting on the table beside his bed, its pages slightly curled from age. It was strange how a few simple words, written centuries ago, had the power to shift something so deep within him. He stood and stretched, walking over to the small window that overlooked the city. Life was already in motion below. People hurrying, cars moving, the endless rhythm of existence playing out as it always did. Yet, despite the rush, he felt no urgency. He had lived much of his life reacting, chasing, worrying, waiting. But now, he saw it differently. The world would move as it always had, but he did not need to be moved by it. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down, flipping open the book again. The next passage spoke of a man who had lost everything, his wealth, his home, even his family. And yet, he had not been broken. He had accepted it with a quiet, unshaken resolve, understanding that suffering was not something to be feared, but something to be endured. That misfortune was not a punishment, but merely a part of life, indifferent and inevitable. He traced the words with his fingertips, letting them settle in his mind. How often had he resisted pain, acted as though hardship was an injustice rather than a certainty? He had spent years fearing loss, avoiding discomfort, trying to shape his life in a way that would shield him from suffering. But the more he had tried to control things, the more powerless he had felt. Perhaps that was the mistake. The belief that he needed to control everything, that peace could only be found when the world bent to his will. But the truth was simpler, yet far more difficult to accept. He would never have control over what happened to him, only how he responded to it. He thought back to a moment from his past, a time when betrayal had left him bitter and angry. He had replayed the events in his mind over and over, clinging to the pain, letting it define him. He had let his anger consume him, believing that if he held onto it tightly enough, it would somehow change the past. But it never had. It had only kept him trapped, reliving a wound that should have healed long ago. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. He had to let go, not because what happened didn't matter, but because his peace mattered more. He had to accept that people would disappoint him, that life would be unfair, that pain would come when he least expected it. And instead of resisting it, instead of trying to rewrite reality, he had to learn to meet it with strength, with a mind that did not waver. His gaze drifted back to the book, to a sentence that now stood out more than the rest. You cannot control the external world, but you can control yourself. And in that control, you will find freedom. Freedom. The word settled over him like a quiet revelation. That was what he had been searching for all along. Not happiness, not success, but freedom. The ability to move through life without being chained to circumstances, to walk through hardship without losing himself in it. He closed the book and looked around his small apartment. Nothing had changed. His life was still the same. The problems he had yesterday were still there. But something within him felt different, like a door had been opened that he could never close again. He would still face difficulties. He would still feel pain. But now, he would not resist it. He would not let it shake him. The sun had fully risen now, its light spilling into the room, illuminating everything in a soft golden glow. He took one last sip of his coffee and stood, ready to face the day. The world outside was as chaotic as ever, but he did not need to be. He had something stronger now, something that no one, no circumstance, no hardship could take from him. A mind that was unshaken, a heart that was steady, a spirit that was free, the The streets were alive with the familiar sounds of morning, car engines humming, distant conversations blending into a dull murmur, footsteps moving in every direction. He walked at his usual pace, yet everything felt different. The world hadn't changed, but something inside him had. The thoughts that once weighed him down had loosened their grip, like chains rusting and falling away. He wasn't free from problems, but he was free from the illusion that they controlled him. He passed by a cafe he used to frequent, where he had once spent hours lost in distractions, drowning his worries in noise, coffee, and meaningless conversations. He had often sought comfort in the presence of others, believing that their validation would quiet the doubts inside him. But now, he understood that peace didn't come from others. It came from within. He had been looking in the wrong places all along. He continued walking, passing by a park where children played, their laughter sharp against the quiet weight of his thoughts. He envied their simplicity, the way they existed so fully in the present, unburdened by regrets of the past or fears of the future. How had he lost that? When had he allowed himself to become so tangled in the what-ifs and should-haves that he forgot how to live in the now? As he crossed the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message. The kind he would have obsessed over before, his mind racing to interpret its tone, worrying about how to respond. But this time he felt no rush, no urgency. He would answer when he was ready. He was no longer a slave to the constant pull of expectations. He would no longer let the outside world dictate his inner state. A sudden gust of wind carried the scent of rain, and he looked up at the sky, watching the dark clouds gather in the distance. Most people quickened their pace, rushing to their destinations before the storm arrived. But he didn't. He simply kept walking, unbothered by the possibility of getting caught in the rain. What did it matter? It was just weather. Like everything else in life, it would come and go, beyond his control. He could either resist it, complain about it, or simply let it be. His thoughts drifted back to the book, to the words that had stayed with him through the night. You suffer more in imagination than in reality. How many times had he allowed his mind to torment him with fears that never came true? How often had he relived past pain, dragging it into the present, keeping it alive when it should have faded? He realized now how much of his suffering had been self-inflicted, not by the events themselves, but by his refusal to accept them. He reached a quiet alley where an old man sat on a wooden stool, repairing a worn-out pair of shoes. The man's hands were steady, his movements slow but precise, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. There was a quiet dignity in his work, a focus that felt almost sacred. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't complaining. He was simply doing what needed to be done. For a moment, he just stood there, watching. There was a lesson in this, he realized. So much of life was about showing up, doing the work, accepting the moment for what it was, instead of wishing it were different. He had spent too much time fighting against reality, exhausting himself in a battle he could never win. But the old man had already learned what he was just beginning to understand. Peace was not found in control, but in surrender. Not in weakness, but in the quiet strength of accepting what is. He nodded slightly in silent respect and moved on, the sound of the man's tools tapping against leather fading behind him. By the time he reached his apartment, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, tapping against the rooftops, the sidewalks, the windows. He stepped inside, watching as the world outside blurred in the downpour. There was something beautiful about it, the way the rain fell without hesitation, without doubt. It did not ask for permission. It simply was. He sat by the window, listening to the rhythm of the storm, feeling a deep sense of stillness settle within him. He thought about all the storms he had faced in his life, the ones that had shaken him, broken him, left him questioning everything. And yet, he was still here, still standing, still breathing. He understood now that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up again and again, without resentment, without bitterness, without losing oneself in the struggle. It was about walking through the storm, not with anger or resistance, but with quiet acceptance, knowing that all storms pass eventually. And so he sat there unshaken, watching as the rain fell, knowing that when the storm cleared, he would still be standing.